Tonight I will be talking about sport and physical education, largely from an intellectual side of things, how people conceived of physical education. And I look at gentlemen's handbooks for this. These gentlemen's handbooks were written by schoolmasters, academics, courtiers, gentlemen, people who are concerned with the education of youth, to bring them up in a certain style of civilized society, as well as polite society, is more the term used in the 18th century. So these gentlemen handbooks are etiquette guides and educational plans that parents would have used for planning their children's education. And for me, I'm looking at what the education of young boys. There were contemporary books for the gentlewomen that were sometimes a second volume of these works, but I'm not going to be looking at those so much tonight, just the gentleman's handbooks. So, who was the complete gentleman that Henry Peacham titled his 1622 work after? Was he a real man or a figment of the imagination? From reading Peacham's texts, we know that he was witty, multilingual, well-traveled, moral, kind, religiously observant, logical, and athletic. He was a man who embodied sprezzatura, a way of carrying oneself and performing actions with simplicity and ease, with either real or feigned mastery. Throughout the early modern period, European, English, and Scottish intellectuals and pedagogues repeatedly conceptualized and reconceptualized how best to train courtiers and gentlemen to wield both the mighty weapons of the pen and the sword. Keith M. Brown argues that exercise was integral to early modern Scottish adolescent education. It taught important life skills that were encouraged by the Renaissance's rediscovery of antiquity and its respect for the male body. Sport permeated noble culture, daily conversation, and it was influenced by these educational theorists, such as this gentleman here, Count Baldassare Castiglione, an Italian man, very famous courtier of his day, followed by his English equivalent, Sir Thomas Elyot, and followed by Roger Ascham, who was the tutor to Queen Elizabeth. He was a very keen archer and wrote a really important text on archery and the different forms that it takes. There was also Henry Peacham, who I mentioned at the beginning, Richard Brathwaite, who was closely associated with Puritanism, Abbot Claude Fleury, this gentleman here, who you might know from philosophy, John Locke, and also Jean-Jacques Rousseau. These authors strove to attract fathers, tutors, and schoolmasters to use their texts when acculturating youth into civil and polite society. So this talk examines the gentleman's handbooks and unpublished personal writings produced by and read by the northern elite of Scotland to highlight four themes: education for societal development, exercise for education, exercise for health, and finally, exercise and morality. This thematic approach shows the northern elite's participation within wider intellectual trends. So, to begin with, education for societal development. The purpose of education, as perceived in early modern Scotland, especially among the Protestants, was to create a literate, intelligent, and well-trained society that was religiously observant and moral. This section examines how the elites conceived of education and applied their theories in attempts to facilitate societal development in the direction which they thought was best. Prior to the 17th century, however, the North had already produced three universities. Bishop Ethelstone of Aberdeen founded King's College in 1495 to, as he sought, amend the ignorance of the North. The Earl of Marshall, acknowledging the resistance to Protestantism after the Reformation in sections of the North at the end of the 16th century, founded Marshall College in 1593 to provide university instruction that strictly adhered to the Reformed Church. Both of these institutions followed a European model. Sir Alexander Fraser of Philorth formulated a similar improving initiative to found a college when he was granted royal permission to erect Fraserburgh, a borough of the barony, in 1592. His plans were further ratified by Parliament in 1597. This ill-fated institution barely opened its doors before they were closed again in 1605, when the principal and 17 zealous ministers were incarcerated by the Privy Council for holding a prohibited assembly in Aberdeen. The buildings were quickly divested of their use and put to a different purpose. The college would have also had serious competition from Marischal College as a reformed university, as did the borough when Aberdeen challenged its privileges. Therefore, by the 17th century, it is possible to see a northward trend of the expansion of the idea that societal development required a robust education, not just rudimentary literacy. This theme remained prominent in the North for the next 2 centuries. It was found in both personal correspondence and widely accessible texts. So we have this man who's no stranger to Dornoch back in his day. He was the 4th son of the Earl of Sutherland, and he became tutor to the young Earl John, as we know from the records of Dornoch in the history of Gaul. He became tutor to the young Earl in 1615 and stayed as his mentor and guide until his majority. Gordon was an accomplished bibliophile. His library reflected his superb education, which surpassed any of his countrymen. And his library, which holds the catalogue of it that I've seen in 1813 when it was put up for auction, held over 5,000 volumes. And this is when books were very expensive. So his collection of pedagogical texts reveals his personal interest for education. They include Ascham's Scholar Petitions of Shooting, 1571, Castiglione's The Courtier, which had already been out for 50 years. He has a 1580 edition in French, Elyot's The Book Named the Governor in 1556 edition, as well as his Castle of Health, which talks about the benefits of exercise for health, as well as King James VI and First Basilican Doran, 1603 edition that was published on his coronation, as well as Machiavelli's The Prince and Henry Peacham's The Complete Gentleman. In addition, he owned 2 copies of the Book of Sports, which was written by King James VI and then reproduced by his son, Charles I. And with his knowledge of these works and his own experiences as a successful courtier, he started to formulate a plan for education for his nephew. In 1620, he penned a letter providing personal advice to his pupil. The letter demonstrated the necessity of a proper education for both the Earl and the common people. Gordon recommended to John that on his education be both academic and physical. And it was incredibly similar to what Castiglione wrote, and even more so to what the king was writing. He would have known the king quite well. He was a gentleman of the bedchamber to the king, so there was a very close connection between these two men. He wrote to the Earl that he was to enjoy in the acquisition of knowledge. When your leisure serves, read. And he was to have some insights in all sciences, chiefly in cosmology and geography, which becomes a man of your quality. To complement his academic grounding, Gordon insisted, nearly verbatim from Basilican Doran, in your language be plain, honest, merry, natural, quick and short, and without affection or gesture in terms. Use merriness, gaiety, according to the appropriate situation. John was also instructed to learn multiple European languages while he traveled abroad. Traveling abroad was also a very important way of learning in this time period, going on the grand tour of Europe. Sir Robert Gordon didn't want him crossing the Alps, but he wanted him to travel throughout the rest of Europe. Probably because he was a staunch Presbyterian and didn't want him being influenced by the Catholics in Italy. So, in terms of his politics, Gordon used the letter to instruct John to follow the king's mandate on facilitating the spread of civility and sought to transform the lower ranks of society, especially Gallic society. The letter expressed also a strategy to improve Sutherland economically by raising Dornoch to a borough, the royal borough status, which eventually happened in 1628. To transform the people of Sutherland, the Earl was to first plant schools throughout Sutherland, with the chief being in Dornoch. Second, encourage English literacy, inspire the local gentlemen to send their children there so they would be fit for the Earl's service. And lastly, build a library in Dornoch for his own personal use and, in his own words, to amend their ignorance which increases through the lack of books. These developments were, in his own words again, to take away the relics of Irish barbarity which yet remains in your country, to wit, the Irish language and habit. His meaning of Irish being the Gaelic language. Gordon's plans reflected the motivations in the statutes and bands of Iona, which sought to bring civility to the Western Highlands and Islands, and did so through a process of educating the chieftain's eldest children within a lowland and courtly education, bringing them from their base in the west to a totally new place where they had to learn how to behave in a courtly fashion. That said, the Earl of Sutherland was instructed to learn the vulgar language of Gaelic, so he could truly understand and judge his people. Gordon therefore recognized that this transformation towards civility was not going to be immediate, and there was a linguistic and cultural balance, a form of hybridity that a large portion of the northern elite had. To administer their holdings effectively, within this cultural grayscale, John had to be cognizant of the courtly culture, as well as culturally and linguistically aware of the practices of his people.